Welcome to a journey unlike any other. This is Echoes of the Rift, the Cadet Trials, a gripping science fiction saga set on Hellion Rift, a living, breathing jungle world where survival is not just a test of strength, but of will, of empathy, and of identity. 20 cadets from across the stars are dropped into a trial they were never truly prepared for. Stripped of technology, surrounded by mysteries older than civilization, and hunted by forces both alien and ancient. In this story, fear has a voice, the forest remembers, and the difference between passing and vanishing lies in the choices you make when no one is watching. So sit back, take a deep breath, and step into a world where the trees whisper secrets and only the listeners survive. The descent began in silence. From the observation bay of the Stellar Ascendancy Korr transport vessel, the vast jungle planet of Hellion Rift appeared almost tranquil, just a sphere of dense green coiled with clouds, spinning slowly against a backdrop of fractured stars. But that illusion shattered the moment the drop pods launched. Jasonna, Jace, Korr felt the first violent jolt as her pod detached from the hull and began its screaming fall. Gravity reversed, twisted, and pressed against her chest like a coiled fist. Through the narrow viewport, she caught flashes of other cadets descending. 20 in total, each from a different species, each alone. Some pods spun erratically, others deployed stabilizers and slipped through the atmosphere like knives. The sky below boiled in shades of green and copper. Jace didn't close her eyes. She wanted to see what was waiting. Her pod punched through the upper canopy, the outer hull scorching and shaking. The foliage wasn't just trees, it was movement, a living, shifting skin of the planet. Leaves the size of solar sails slapped against the glass. A shriek, not mechanical, howled outside as something brushed against the pod. Not wind, not weather. Something aware. The pod slammed into the ground with a thud that ricocheted through her spine. Steam hissed from the valves, and for one brief moment, the world went still. She unclasped the safety harness and reached for the wristband kit strapped to her thigh. No emergency flares. No comms. That was the rule. Only instincts, wit, and whatever your species gave you. And for Jace, raised in the Moss Ridge Mountains of Old Terra, survival wasn't a theory. It was a memory baked into every scar. The hatch hissed open. Heat and rot spilled in. She stepped into the wild. The air was thick, almost viscous. It clung to her skin, seeping into her lungs with every breath. Around her, trees twisted like muscle and bone, bark slick with moisture and throbbing faintly, as if the entire forest pulsed to a slow, ancient heartbeat. Nothing was uniform. Nothing was symmetrical. Hellion Rift was alive, and it wasn't hiding the fact. A distant sonic boom echoed across the horizon. Someone else had landed hard. Another pod clipped a branch high above and spun out of control, crashing somewhere with a distant crunch of metal and foliage. Jace didn't flinch. She crouched low, placing a hand against the mossy earth. The soil was warm, not just sun-heated, biologically active. She could feel the tremor of root systems shifting beneath her, like something rearranging its nerves. She straightened slowly and scanned the tree line. In the distance, she spotted Threx Varn, the Voker cadet, already out of his pod and emitting low-frequency clicks into the jungle. Echolocation, effective in caves. Here, the sound disappeared as though swallowed. To her right, a blue-scaled figure, probably Nail-Thurin of Thalvora, was struggling to construct shelter with thick jungle leaves. The leaves refused to bond. They curled and twisted as if resisting his hands. Behind her, a burst of flame erupted from the canopy. Someone had triggered a pyronite shard too early. The scream that followed was brief. Then silence. Hellion Rift was testing them from the first breath. And yet, through the chaos, Jace felt something else. Not fear, not awe. Something familiar. Like the forest had been waiting, not just for cadets, but for her. She narrowed her eyes. Above the canopy, just for a second, she thought she saw movement. Not a drone, not a creature. A shadow in the sky, watching. Jace didn't look away. She whispered to herself. Let's see who's really being tested. The trial had begun. Jasonna, Jace, Korr had landed without ceremony, her boots sinking slightly into the sponge-like surface of Helion Rift. Around her, the jungle inhaled, branches shifting as if reacting to her arrival, not passively, but curiously. She took her first real breath outside the pod, and the air fought back, thick with spores, humidity, and something acrid that stung her throat like sour copper. She didn't cough. Instead, she dropped to one knee and ran her fingers across the ground. The moss was damp but warm, buzzing faintly with microscopic life. Underneath it, fibrous threads writhed, as if the very floor of the forest didn't like to be touched. Jace muttered under her breath, "You feel that? Like nerves." She didn't expect an answer, but the stillness that followed her words felt too deliberate. Most cadets would be panicking by now. Many had grown up in simulated environments, surrounded by protocols and filtered oxygen. Jace had grown up off-grid in Terradia's backwoods, where instinct wasn't a concept, it was a reflex. She wasn't here to prove she was human. She was here because surviving was the only thing she'd ever known how to do. She moved carefully, ducking low as she left the shadow of her drop pod. No weapons, only the straight blade in her belt. The rules were clear. No advanced tech, no comms, no outside assistance. This wasn't just a test of physical endurance. It was a psychological crucible. Jace scanned the tree line, then began to move. She didn't follow a straight path. The jungle didn't allow for it. Vines arched across the space like ribs, and trees bulged in impossible shapes. Some curved back toward the ground, others seemed to spiral into themselves. At one point, she passed a trunk that was split open, its core glowing faintly from within like exposed muscle. She didn't stop. Every few steps, her boots made contact with patches of earth that felt wrong, either too soft or too resistant, like stepping on a breath that hadn't finished. Her senses were dialed up, every movement precise. Birds didn't chirp here. Nothing did. The forest communicated in rustles and weight shifts, in temperature swings and scent. It was a language she could almost understand. She paused near a narrow clearing and knelt again. She noticed small, bone-thin stalks growing in circles, their tips swaying even though there was no wind. She reached out to touch one, but it recoiled before she could. Not from motion, from awareness. That confirmed it. This place wasn't just alive. It was awake. Her pulse didn't quicken. Not yet. But she did something she hadn't done since childhood. She whispered a quiet word of respect to the forest itself. Not superstition. Not ritual. Just recognition. Something beneath the surface listened. She stood slowly and wiped her hand against her pants. In the far distance, a pod exploded, sending up a curl of red smoke. Another cadet had failed the landing. She didn't look back. Helion Rift didn't reward those who hesitated. The jungle screamed, but not with sound. Jasonna, Jace, Korr felt it before she heard it. The ripple in the air, the subtle shift in the canopy's rhythm. Something had changed. Somewhere nearby, a cadet had made a mistake, and the forest had noticed. A shrill burst of movement cracked through the underbrush. To Jace's left, she caught a glimpse of Torvin Malk, the thick-set Dorothi cadet, running full tilt through the trees, his wide frame crashing into vines and splashing through shallow bogs. He carried nothing. His eyes were wide with confusion, not strategy. Behind him, the ground quivered unnaturally. He didn't see the root that rose under his boot. 1 second he was running. The next, he was airborne, yanked backward by something serpentine and pulsing. His scream was brief, muffled as he disappeared into the foliage. The vegetation closed in behind him like a wound healing itself. Jace didn't move. She just breathed, slow, quiet, calculating. Another shout echoed farther ahead, high-pitched and frantic. Celiira Vex, the Elisari cadet, was trying to hover above the forest floor on pollen levitation. But the spores she summoned reacted badly, clumping in thick, fluorescent clusters that swarmed her exoskeleton. She spun, disoriented, and collapsed against a twisting tree that shivered on contact. The bark opened slightly, revealing fibrous strands that clung to her limbs. The forest wasn't passive. It engaged. To the east, a dull hum throbbed in pulses. Zhuruan Kai was attempting something foolish, tapping into magnetic fields from Halion Rift's mineral-rich terrain. He had etched sigils into bark with finger chalk, trying to stabilize a levitating platform. The moment he stepped onto it, the polarity reversed with a violent snap. The air around him crackled, then exploded in a shower of static and scorched leaves. A moment later, a red sigma flare blinked weakly in the distance. Extraction. Jace didn't pity them, not because she lacked empathy, but because pity wouldn't keep her alive. Every distraction was a liability. She focused on what the forest had revealed. Its rules were not the rules of gravity or thermodynamics or even biology. This place had logic, but not one humans had mapped. Above her, a vine shifted of its own accord. She stepped aside before it could drop. Not far ahead, Nail Theroin cried out in frustration. He was using secretion gel from his palms to bond leaves into a shelter, but they dissolved under his touch, releasing a cloud of bitter spores that drove him backward, coughing. Jace watched it all, without moving from her position. The others were fighting the forest. She had decided, from the moment she stepped out of her pod, to listen to it instead. It didn't take long for the first drone to arrive. Jasonna Jace Korr caught sight of it through the branches, a sleek, obsidian shell cutting through the canopy without a sound. Unlike the retrieval units, this one bore no medical arms or harness systems. Just a single blinking eye and the insignia of the Stellar Ascendancy Corps. A Spectre drone. It hovered above a collapsed shelter, scanning the wreckage with surgical precision. Beneath it, the charred remains of what had been a heat crystal, a pyronite shard, improperly activated, still hissed with residual energy. The cadet responsible was nowhere in sight. A red beacon blinked once, then went dark. Failure wasn't just about survival. It was about obedience. The Academy had been explicit. No advanced tools, no AI assistance, no communication uplinks. All tech was to be disabled upon entry. The only exception was the Riftband kit, which offered basic utilities, cord, a blade, a thermal square, but nothing smart. The point wasn't to win. It was to endure, as you are. But not everyone followed the rules. To Jace's right, the air shimmered briefly. She turned and saw Valendros, the Lumaran cadet, crouched behind a root cluster. His fingers glowed faintly, using embedded biolum flares to signal something unseen. Jace didn't speak. She didn't have to. The drone was already on him. It descended in a whisper and unleashed a pulse of cold light. Valen's flares flickered out. His body stiffened as a net of electrostatic threads wrapped around his torso. A second later, he was airborne, yanked into the undergrowth by an Aegis drone like prey plucked by a silent predator. No warning. No nikchir. Just removal. Jace exhaled slowly, her muscles tensed. The lesson was clear. Technology wasn't forbidden because it was unfair. It was forbidden because it distorted the nature of the test. Halion Rift didn't care who had neural implants or algorithmic foresight. It responded to presence, to adaptation, to instinct. Jace tightened the strap on her straight blade and continued deeper into the trees. The forest didn't offer second chances, and neither did the Korr. The sun, or whatever passed for it on Halion Rift, began to dim, not gradually but in stuttering pulses, as if someone behind the sky was flicking a faulty switch. Jasonna Jace Korr paused beneath the arch of a twisted tree, her breath held. The canopy above seemed to bend ever so slightly inward, as if the jungle itself were leaning closer. She wasn't alone, not in the obvious sense. She had always expected other cadets, drones, and the forest creatures. But this was different. This was observation, measured, intentional. She noticed it first when she stepped into a narrow ravine, the temperature dropping just a few degrees, only while she passed. Later, she'd reached for a hanging vine, only to find it recoiling before her hand made contact. Even her footsteps, previously muffled by the mossy floor, began to echo faintly, like something beneath the surface was tracking her rhythm. Eyes. She couldn't see them, but she felt them, pressing from above, behind, inside the branches. Not animal eyes. Not drone optics. Something else. Older. The forest had patterns, but it also had blind spots. Jace stepped into one now, what she called a quiet zone. The leaves no longer rustled. The air went still. And for the first time since landing, the weight of Helion Rift wasn't pressing in. It was waiting. Jace turned slowly in place, scanning the treetops. No movement, but something caught her attention, an irregularity in the shadows. A shape that didn't belong. A silhouette high above that shifted slightly when she blinked. She didn't panic. Instead, she crouched low and ran her fingers across the soil again, grounding herself. The dirt was warm, but the roots no longer pulsed. Whatever had been watching had paused. Not lost interest, just paused. That was somehow worse. She rose and looked once more to the canopy. The silhouette was gone, but she knew now it had been real. Not every predator on Helion Rift needed to make noise. Some watched, some waited, and some remembered. Jace took a deep breath, then turned toward the darker part of the forest. If something wanted to study her, it would have to follow. And she didn't plan to make it easy. Jasonna, Jace, Korr didn't wait for the storm. On Helion Rift, there were no forecasts, only instincts. And hers were screaming, "Get off the ground." She moved with purpose, scanning the canopy for a tree that wasn't just tall, but trustworthy. One with angled limbs, minimal fungus, and most importantly, no visible signs of movement. She spotted it 20 meters away, rising through the mist like a pillar of twisted sinew. Its bark gleamed faintly, like it had absorbed metal over time, but it held its shape despite the pressure of the forest around it. That was enough. Jace approached silently, testing the base with the heel of her boot. It didn't tremble. No extraña vibraciones. No recoil. She took it as a rare invitation. Pulling a coiled vine from her wristband kit, she looped it over the first branch and began climbing. Careful, deliberate, never rushed. Every movement recalled afternoons in the Moss Ridge Mountains, scaling trees for solar panels or just a better view of the stars. Her grandfather always said, "The tree doesn't care about your deadline. Move with it, not against it." Halfway up, a gust of wind, or what felt like breath, brushed across her cheek. She paused, listening. No sound, no scent, just that eerie silence again. She kept going. At 15 meters, she reached a thick, split branch that forked into a natural triangle. Perfect. She sat down, letting her legs dangle for a moment. The view was mostly leaves and shadows, but up here, the forest sounded different. Softer, like it didn't expect anyone to get this far. She set to work immediately. Using her straight blade, she carved long strips from the inner bark of a dry limb nearby. The fibers peeled like ribbons, tough and flexible. She chewed one briefly to soften it, bitter, but usable, then began braiding. Her fingers moved quickly, years of practice making each knot familiar. Strong, reliable. Next came frame anchoring. She bent a series of naturally curved branches into a hexagonal layout, tying them at the joints with the bark cords. She reinforced the base with slats cut from a dead vine trunk. Light but strong. Every part had to support her weight, and maybe more. The forest wasn't idle. It watched. Once, when she reached for a strip of bark, she noticed the leaves nearby curling slightly inward. Almost protectively, Jace slowed her motion, muttered a word of thanks, and continued. She didn't know if the forest understood, but she was starting to believe it might. As the structure took shape, she layered the top with wide, palm-like leaves, stitched together with her spinthorn needles and more fiber twine. The needles weren't sharp enough to break skin, but they slid through plant material like glass. She sewed in a crosshatch pattern, forming a roof that arched gently, designed to channel any moisture off the sides. She worked for over an hour. Her hands blistered. Her back ached. But the shelter grew. When she finally leaned back and let out a breath, the platform beneath her groaned softly, then stilled. She was elevated, concealed, and most importantly, safe. For now, a shimmer of light caught her eye, soft blue, faint, and hovering in the air like dust caught in moonlight. Loom sprites drifting near. She didn't reach for them. She simply watched, letting them hover around the edges of her shelter, like guardians unsure of her purpose. She felt the same about them. Night was coming, but she had built something of her own. Jasonna, Jace, Korr awoke to silence that wasn't silence at all. She hadn't meant to fall asleep. Just a brief rest, eyes closed, back pressed to the frame of her shelter. But now, the forest had changed. The wind was gone. So were the distant rustles of foliage, the hisses of insect movement. Even the loom sprites had vanished from the edges of her vision. Something else had taken their place. She sat up slowly, breath shallow, listening not with her ears, but with the tension in her chest, in her bones. Below, the jungle felt like a pond holding its breath. She adjusted the leaf layer above her, parting it just enough to peek through. Then she felt it, a faint thump in the bark beneath her, followed by another, and another, rhythmic, deliberate, heavy. She wasn't the only one in the trees. About 30 feet below, shadows moved between the roots. Not fast, not loud, but certain. Something large, gliding between trunks, as if it belonged there more than the trees themselves. Her pulse steadied, not from calm, but from discipline. She didn't move, didn't flinch. She watched, and then she saw it. It emerged from the shadows, not fully, just enough to give shape to the dread curling in her gut. The creature had 6 legs, each joint bending the wrong way, each movement whisper silent. Its skin was black, but not matte, translucent in places like fluid muscle sliding beneath a membrane. No eyes, no mouth, just a ridge of thin, vibrating fins running along its spine, fluttering with each step like an organic sensor array. It passed beneath her tree, brushing lightly against a vine that recoiled instantly. The forest didn't seem to resist it. It accommodated. Umbrement. She didn't know the name yet, but the moment would etch itself into her memory forever. It paused, not because of sound, not because of motion. It simply stopped, one leg lifted, held aloft mid-step. Then its head turned, not toward her, but past her, up, higher in the canopy. Jace followed its line of sight and froze. Another cadet. She couldn't make out who, just the silhouette of someone perched in a nearby tree, not far above her elevation. Their movement had been small but enough. A shifting limb, a shifting shadow. The umbrement moved again, this time upward. No sound, no chasse, just ascension. Jace could do nothing. Calling out would only draw it to her. Throwing something would risk exposing both of them. She could only watch. The maw climbed without struggle. Its limbs adapted to the curves of the bark like water seeking channels. She heard the snap of a thin branch. A gasp above. Then nothing. No scream. No caress. Just stillness. And moments later, the return of sound, low insect chatter, the sigh of wind, a single loom sprite blinking back into view. It had passed. Jace exhaled slowly, hands still gripping the edge of her platform. Sweat had pooled at the base of her spine, despite the cool air. She didn't know who that cadet had been. She didn't even know if they were still alive. But she knew one thing for certain now. This forest didn't just contain predators. It grew them. And Helion Rift's most dangerous creature had learned to move without disturbing a single leaf. Zerwin Kai had always been brilliant. Arrogant, sure, but undeniably gifted. Among the cadets of the Stellar Ascendancy Corps, he was known for shaping energy with nothing but chalk-drawn code and mental focus. His species, the four-armed technopaths of Elendar Prime, didn't build tools, they became them. But on Helion Rift, brilliance had a habit of getting buried. From her perch, Jasonna Jace, Korr spotted Zerwin's setup before she heard the hum. Nestled within a circle of black stone obelisks, he was crouched low, his forelimbs scrawling intricate glyphs into the ground with shimmering white chalk. The soil itself seemed to reject the markings, pulsing and shifting, but Zerwin persisted. At the center of the design hovered a slab of magnetized crystal, levitating an inch above the moss. A magpulse halo, primitive in construction, advanced in concept. He was building a floating platform. A shelter, perhaps. Maybe even an escape device. Jace narrowed her eyes. The idea was clever. Dangerous. Reckless. As the glyphs pulsed brighter, the surrounding air grew thick, almost pressurized. Leaves wilted inward. Static prickled across her skin, even at a distance. The forest didn't like this. Zerwin stepped onto the halo. It hovered just briefly, enough to give him hope. Then the polarity flipped. The glyphs on the ground surged in reverse, burning white-hot, and the halo emitted a screeching wail like twisting metal under strain. For half a heartbeat, Zerwin hovered midair in a shimmer of violet light. And then it collapsed. The explosion wasn't fire, but force. The moss disintegrated. The stones cracked. Zerwin's body was flung backward into a tree, limp, as arcs of blue static danced across the clearing. A moment later, the familiar hum of an Aegis drone swept in overhead. It hovered, scanned, then lowered a cocoon-shaped harness. Zerwin didn't move as it enveloped him. The drone lifted and vanished through the canopy without ceremony. Jace remained still. No scream, no protest. Just one more cadet trying to bend the forest to his will and being erased by it. Helion Rift did not tolerate cleverness for its own sake. It answered only to understanding. The first drop hit Jace's arm like a kiss of warmth. Unexpected, soft, and almost pleasant. Then she looked at it. It wasn't water. Not really. The liquid shimmered crimson, too thick for rain, with a strange iridescence that rippled beneath the surface. It clung to her skin instead of rolling off, and even before she could brush it away, the warmth intensified into a low burn. Jasonna, Jace, Korr wiped her forearm with a strip of bark and pressed herself flat to her platform. Above, the sky had turned dark amber. Clouds, if they could still be called that, twisted like smoke in water, bleeding red tendrils that stretched across the canopy. The trees began to react. Leaves curled inward. Vines snapped tight against trunks. The jungle was bracing for something. She didn't know if it was a weather event, a defense mechanism, or some chemical purge. But the forest knew, and that was enough for her. A few drops began to patter across the leaf roof she had sewn together earlier. Each one hissed faintly on contact, releasing a wisp of steam. Jace covered her shoulders with a call-tweave shroud from her riftband kit and tucked her knees under her chest. Heat pulsed around her as the rain began in earnest, slow, deliberate, like it had chosen its targets. Then came the scream. Not far to the west, someone shouted, a sharp, raw burst of agony. She recognized the cadence. Veranek, the translucent-skinned cadet. His species dermis was hypersensitive, lacking the protective barriers of others. Jace imagined the rain on that kind of skin, acid meeting glass. There was nothing she could do. She stayed low, listening. Another scream. This one shorter, followed by heavy thrashing and a sound like wet fabric tearing. Something, or someone, was trying to move through the rain, but the canopy fought back. Jace heard vines constricting, branches snapping. The rain didn't fall evenly. It avoided certain zones almost as if guided. She noticed that areas covered in natural moss or lichen remained untouched. Even her tree, high in the canopy and covered in native bark, had become a kind of shelter. Not because she had built it perfectly, but because she had used the right things. She hadn't fought the forest. She had listened. Minutes passed. The rain lightened, leaving behind a faint shimmer on the branches like glass powder. The air smelled metallic and burnt, as though something had been scoured clean. No more screams. No more movement. Just steam and silence. Jace adjusted her position, the heat still radiating from the leaves above. The jungle had tested them with something worse than a predator. It had tested compatibility, and Helion Rift didn't just reject the weak. It rejected the unnatural. The rain had passed, but its presence lingered. Jasonna Jace Korr stayed still on her platform, wrapped in the faintly steaming call-tweave shroud, listening to the forest settle back into its rhythm, or perhaps form a new one. The canopy above no longer pulsed in sync with the wind. It moved to something deeper, something internal. Then the vines began to speak. At first, it was just a sound like bark stretching or roots tightening, but with rhythm. Repetition, not random. Jace narrowed her eyes. From her perch, She watched a bundle of green tendrils twine around each other just beyond arm's reach. They flexed, twisted, released, then repeated. A pattern. She leaned closer. As she did, the movement stopped and silence returned. She waited. The vines resumed, this time slower, more precise. Their shapes mimicked something. Her breath caught. The rhythm wasn't natural. It was syntactic. Language. She didn't dare speak aloud, but her mind was already racing. This wasn't just a communication between trees. This was directed. Intentional. Mimicry, maybe. Or worse, learning. Jace thought back to earlier in the day. Cadets had shouted to one another, argued, cried out. Some had pleaded for extraction. And if Helion Rift was as alive as it appeared, it had heard everything. Now it was repeating. Somewhere to her right, a long vine dangled from a branch. It swung gently, then released a sound. Low, breathy, almost human. Help! The voice was cracked, distorted. But it was real, and it didn't come from a cadet. Jace's skin went cold. A moment later, another vine, farther off, whispered a different word. This time clearer. Run. She looked down at the base of her tree. Nothing stirred, but every root and limb now felt like it was listening. She glanced around. More vines were moving than before. Not wildly, not threateningly, but curiously. It hit her like a tide. The forest wasn't just watching them. It was studying them, echoing voices, mirroring movement, storing sound. Every cry from earlier, every shout, every whispered strategy or scream, absorbed and now returning, not to frighten, but to understand. Or perhaps to lure. Jace sat back slowly, her heartbeat steady but deep. She reached into her Barclay satchel and retrieved the Trier echo stones, turning one slowly in her hand. It hummed faintly. She didn't activate them yet. Not until she knew who, or what, was truly speaking, and whether the forest was done listening or just getting started. Night on Helion Rift didn't fall. It descended, layer by layer, like a shroud being drawn over something sacred and dangerous. Jasonna, Jace, Korr sat motionless inside her tree-born shelter, the cult-weave shroud wrapped loosely around her shoulders, her fingers resting on the coiled fibers of the floor she'd woven by hand. The air had stilled again, not from lack of wind, but as if even the atmosphere was preparing for what came after dark. She'd expected more screams, but there were none. Only the low creak of distant wood, the distant groan of the forest exhaling, then nothing. Then came the light. It began as a flicker below her platform, a dim pulse like a heartbeat, then another to her left, and then a dozen more. Tiny blue orbs drifted into view, floating silently upward, their glow cool but steady. Loom sprites. She remembered the name from an old cadet file, filed under non-aggressive bioluminescent fauna. But this wasn't casual behavior. This was organized. They didn't swarm. They arranged. One by one, they hovered in a place around her shelter, spacing themselves evenly in a wide arc. Then more rose to join them, shifting, flickering, adjusting positions with subtle grace. Jace's breath caught as the pattern formed. Not chaotic, not random. It was a shape, a signal. She didn't recognize the symbol at first, but her brain began filling in gaps, triangular nodes, spiral center, radiating lines. She'd seen something like it on an old, faded banner at the Stellar Ascendancy Corps Orientation Hall. A forgotten emblem of the first interspecies treaty, or was it older? The loom sprites shimmered, their glow intensifying, then dimming again, flashing rhythmically, as if communicating through light instead of sound. Not to each other, to her. Jace leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. Her survival training had included first contact theory, but this wasn't a species. It was the forest, or something within it, using the forest. Every hair on her arms rose as the realization sank in. She wasn't just being watched anymore. She was being recognized. The symbol slowly shifted. Lines detached, reformed. It became an arrow, pointing due north toward the ridgeline she'd avoided earlier in the day. There were no cadet signals from that direction. No screams. No drones. Just uncharted forest. The loom sprites pulsed one last time, then drifted apart. Not up, not down, away. They vanished into the trees without sound, like a curtain falling after a silent performance. Jace remained still for a long time, processing. Signals weren't supposed to come from the environment. Warnings weren't supposed to come from glowing insects. But here, on Helion Rift, the unnatural was natural, and the natural didn't care for explanation. She reached into her Barclay's satchel and pulled out one of the Trier Echo Stones, pressing its smooth, reflective surface against her palm. She didn't activate it. Not yet. But the pulse of her own heartbeat matched the rhythm the loom sprites had used. It wasn't a coincidence. Somewhere deep inside the forest, something had seen her, not just as another cadet, but as something else. The night around her held its breath again. Not in fear, not even in menace, but in anticipation. Whatever lived here, whatever remembered the old symbols, had just extended a message. And now it was her move. The jungle never truly slept. But tonight, Helion Rift did something far more unsettling. It listened. Jasonna, Jace's Korr moved carefully through the upper branches, her shelter temporarily abandoned. The signal from the loom sprites had been too specific, too deliberate to ignore. She hadn't told anyone. There was no one left near enough to tell. Still, she left behind a tiny trail of Trier Echo Stones, wedged between bark seams, just in case someone else made it this far. The temperature had dropped sharply. Each breath came out in visible puffs. The bark beneath her boots felt slicker than usual, almost as if the forest itself was sweating. A bad sign. The last time this happened, something died. A scream split the air. Not far, maybe 200 meters to the south. It was Rogateln, deep voice unmistakable even when twisted with panic. The cadet from Vulcanes, built like a mountain, not easily shaken. Jace froze, crouched low on a branch. She could see faint flashes of movement through the treetops, someone running hard, something behind them keeping pace. The Umbra Maw had returned. She couldn't see it clearly. She never could. It didn't move like a predator. It threaded through the trees, using its environment like a second skin. One moment it was below, the next beside, never rushing, never still. It wasn't chasing, it was herding. She recognized the pattern. A second scream joined the first. Kezra Nail, the exoskeletal cadet. She and Roga must have been traveling together. That was rare. Most cadets avoided pairing after the first few were picked off. It made them easier targets. But the Umbra Maw wasn't killing for speed. It was testing behaviors. Jace held her breath as the trees around her trembled. The Maw was close now. She pressed herself flat against the trunk, listening, not for footsteps but for absence. That's how it signaled its approach. The jungle went quiet in its wake. A flash of movement caught her eye. Roga barreling through the undergrowth below, hauling Kezra half-dragged over his shoulder. Her leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. One of her outer plates cracked. Jace's heart jumped. They weren't going to make it at that pace. And the Maw knew it. Branches split open ahead of them, not by accident, but by design. The forest was opening corridors, forcing them into a funnel. Roga hesitated at the turn. Too late. A blur of black muscle dropped from the canopy and knocked him flat. He screamed as his body hit the roots, Kezra tumbling away, gasping. The Umbra Maw didn't strike. It studied. It loomed over Roga's writhing form, fins along its back fluttering like a radar dish. One clawed limb extended, not to kill but to trace his chest, slow and surgical. Roga choked on a scream. His suit's auto-defense system flickered to life, releasing a pulse of electric static. The Maw twitched, then it mimicked the pulse. Jace's blood ran cold. She'd seen intelligent predators before, pack hunters, ambush strategists, but this was different. The Maw was integrating information, responding not by instinct, but by analysis. Below, Kezra had managed to crawl to a nearby tree, slamming her fist against a root node. A Sigma flare blinked red, but the Maw ignored it. It turned toward her instead, sensing movement, calculating proximity. Jace knew she had seconds. She drew a small vibe lure from her belt, a noise-masking decoy. She slammed it against the bark beside her, then threw a second one to the east. both activated, emitting a soft, pulsing buzz like footsteps. The maw paused. Its body stiffened. It truly looked, toward the lure's source. Then it moved. Not in confusion, but in interest. It leapt through the trees, veering away from Roga and Kezra toward the signal. For now, that was enough. Jace didn't wait. She scrambled down the branches, sliding into the foliage behind Kezra. Roga was groaning, but conscious. She gripped his arm and pulled. Up. Now. He blinked, dazed but obeyed. Between the three of them, they managed a shaky retreat. North, toward the ridgeline the loom sprites had pointed her to. She didn't know what was waiting out there, but she knew what was behind. The Umbra Maw had learned how to stalk. Soon, it might learn how to outthink. And if it ever learned how to predict, they'd all be gone before morning. The deeper they moved into the forest, the quieter it became. Not the silence of absence, but of reverence. Even Rogatelm, limping beside Jasonna, Jace Korr, stopped his usual muttering. Kezra Nail's breathing slowed, her cracked exoskeleton no longer leaking plasma, stabilized with Jace's improvised bar compress. Something in the air had shifted. The trees grew wider here, spaced farther apart. Their roots didn't twist and grasp like before. They retreated as if giving space. The light filtering through the canopy above wasn't moonlight, not exactly. It had a faint violet hue, and it pulsed faintly, like it was synced to something underground. Jace spotted it first. Half buried in moss and ivy, a shape jutted from the slope of a shallow rise. Not natural, not grown. It was stone, dark, smooth, and carved with angles too perfect for erosion. At first, it looked like a broken wall. Then she saw the edges. A doorway, half collapsed but still intact. Kezra whispered hoarsely, "That's not on the maps." "Nothing out here is," Jace murmured. Roga reached forward and wiped away a layer of ash-colored lichen. Beneath it, a symbol revealed itself, concentric circles surrounding a sharp, triangular core. Jace froze. She'd seen that exact mark before. In the entrance hall of the Stellar Ascendancy Core Training Facility, etched above the door leading to the Hall of Doctrine. A symbol the instructors never explained. Just a relic, they said. A tribute to old treaties. But it hadn't looked like a tribute then. And it didn't now. It looked like a signature. "This place wasn't made by the forest," Rogus said. "This is constructed." Jace stepped forward, carefully brushing aside vines. The door led into a chamber, only partially caved in. The stone floor inside was cool, unnaturally flat, and littered with shattered fragments of something once crystalline. Walls were covered in markings, some etched, others burned in thin tracer lines. She recognized none of the script, but her pulse quickened when one particular image caught her eye. A humanoid figure, alone, standing beneath the symbol. Not surrounded by others. Not in battle. Simply standing with the forest towering behind it. Kezra limped forward. "That's not us," she whispered. "That's something else." Jace nodded slowly. "Or someone who came before." The implications sank in like slow poison. This wasn't just a test site. This wasn't some randomly chosen hostile biome used by the Korr to filter out cadets. This was a place built for something, and not by the Korr. Or maybe it had been built by them, just not in the era Jace knew. Roga moved to the far wall where a set of collapsed columns lay. He reached between two stones and pulled something loose, a shard of silvery metal, about the size of his hand. Its edge flickered with faint blue lines. Energy signature. Still active. "What is that?" Kezra asked. "Beacon tech," Roga muttered. "Pre-ascendancy era. It shouldn't exist out here." Jace took the shard and examined it. It wasn't just old, it was buried. Deliberately. The kind of artifact you don't lose by accident. She turned it over, revealing another marking, this one familiar. A smaller version of the Spectra drone insignia. Kezra stumbled back. "Wait, you're telling me this monument, this whole thing, was known to them? To the Korr?" "No," Jace said flatly. "Worse, it was theirs." She stared back at the humanoid carving on the wall. The way the forest seemed to give space to the monument. The loom sprites leading her here. The signal pattern that matched core-level architecture. Helion Rift wasn't just ancient. It was recording. The Korr hadn't chosen it for its brutality. They'd chosen it because it held something they were still trying to understand. Or maybe something they'd already lost control of. Jace tucked the beacon shard in her Barclay's satchel. The others didn't protest. They understood now. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about exposure. Something in the trees above clicked softly, an unnatural sound. Not a predator. Not a cadet. A drone. Spectre class. Watching. It didn't descend. It didn't move. It just hovered, its sensor dome rotating silently, like it was waiting for confirmation that they'd found it. Jasonna, Jace, Korr didn't sleep that night. None of them did. They had retreated from a monument at dusk, finding temporary shelter beneath a ring of hollowed trees that bent inward like cupped hands. The drone had vanished back into the canopy, silent as it came, but its presence lingered like static in the air. Jay sat with her back to the bark, the cult-weave shroud wrapped around her shoulders. Kezra was already unconscious, her body entering a regenerative cycle, while Rogus sat upright, sharpening his straight-up blade more out of ritual than necessity. The fire they'd started earlier had long since burned down to glowing embers. Neither spoke. The wind shifted, and the forest whispered. At first, she thought it was just another hallucination, fatigue blending with ambient noise. But then she heard it again, not from a direction, but from everywhere, as though the leaves, the moss, even the soil had found voice. Jasonna. Call. She stiffened. It wasn't possible. No one here knew her full name, not even the other cadets. During induction, she had chosen to go by Jace, a name that let her blend in, disappear beneath the uniformity of training schedules and assessments. But this voice, it reached into something older, something personal. She turned toward Roga, but he hadn't moved. He was still carving slowly, unaware. The sound hadn't reached him. Just her. She stood up carefully, scanning the shadows. The glow of the embers barely lit the twisted bark around them, but she caught a movement, slight, deliberate. A vine curled downward from a branch above, swaying in a rhythm that matched the cadence of the voice. Jasonna, child of Teridia, do you remember the stars? She took one slow step forward. Who's there? She whispered. No answer. Just rustling. Not wind. Speech. Another vine uncurled, this one touching the dirt at her feet and sketching a spiral into the ash. The same spiral carved into the monument. Jace's breath hitched. This wasn't mimicry. This was communication. More shapes formed. Circles intersecting triangles. A symbol. A name. A memory. She could see it now in her mind's eye. Her grandfather's voice, telling her stories by the lantern in the Moss Ridge cabin, always finishing with the same phrase. The forest doesn't forget, Jace. Only people do. Her throat tightened. It wasn't possible. He'd never served in the Korr. He'd never left Old Terra. But somehow, the forest knew. Jasonna, do you remember the old words? She dropped to her knees, fingers trembling as she reached toward the dirt pattern. Why me? She asked aloud, voice cracking. Why now? The forest didn't reply directly. But the wind shifted again, warmer now, carrying the scent of wet iron and soil and something faintly sweet, like the old tea her grandfather used to brew. Her eyes burned, not from smoke, from something older than fear. Recognition. Roga stirred behind her. You good? He asked, voice groggy. She blinked and stood quickly. Yeah, just heard something. He nodded and leaned back. This place is full of things we're not supposed to hear. She didn't respond. The symbols in the dirt were already fading, erased by unseen roots coiling gently across the surface. Jace looked up once more toward the treetops. The forest had spoken, and now it waited. The stillness didn't last. By early morning, the canopy had darkened again, not from nightfall, but from something heavier pressing down. Fog twisted through the upper branches, and the temperature dropped in sharp, unnatural waves. Jasonna Jace, Korr felt the warning in her bones before she heard the first movement. The Umbra Maw was back, but this time it wasn't stalking individuals. It was hunting a group. Jace, Roga Telm, and Kezra Nail had moved quickly after the forest's voice faded, cutting east through dense growth toward a ravine they'd spotted earlier. The plan was simple: find elevation, isolate their trail, and get out of the open. It wasn't enough. The Maw was faster now, smarter. It avoided traps. It didn't fall for the vibe lure this time. And worst of all, it no longer needed to see them. It could predict them. They heard it coming in rhythmic pulses, branches flexing above, roots curling behind, air pulled in and exhaled in wet, guttural bursts. It wasn't alone anymore. Other shapes flickered at the edges of Jace's vision. Smaller, faster, offspring maybe. Mimics. Kezra stumbled as a low root shifted under her, her injured leg finally giving out. Roga caught her before she hit the ground, lifting her onto his back without hesitation. His exosuit creaked under the strain. "Keep moving," Jace hissed, slicing through a curtain of hanging moss with her straighta blade. They broke through the thicket and into the ravine, dry and rocky, shielded on both sides by tall stone walls. Perfect funnel. Terrible trap. Jace skidded to a stop, eyes scanning the terrain. "We can't outrun it," she said, breath ragged. "Not like this." Kezra shook her head weakly. "We split. Make noise. Distract it. No, rogar snapped. We're not doing that." But Jace already knew. There was no other way. Kezra slid off Roga's back, gripping her blade. She looked at Jace with calm certainty. "It's already seen me as weak. It won't expect to fight." "Don't," Jace said, stepping closer. Kezra smiled. "It's not a loss if it buys you time." Then, without waiting for permission, she turned and limped back into the trees. Jace wanted to follow, wanted to scream, but her feet didn't move. A heartbeat later, the Maw arrived. It dropped into the ravine just as Kezra's silhouette vanished behind the roots. It didn't chase. It paused, as if sensing her choice. Then it followed, slow and deliberate. Seconds stretched like hours. Then came a sound. Not a scream, not a cry. Impact and silence. Jace's hands were clenched so tightly her nails cut into her palms. Roga placed a hand on her shoulder. She knew what she was doing. No part of her wanted to accept it, but every part of her understood it. They moved. Fast. No more speaking. No more hesitation. By the time the sun began to rise, if the dim red glow counted as such, they had cleared the ridgeline and entered a basin of smooth, glass-like stone, a place untouched by growth. Unnatural. Jace stopped at the edge, looking back only once. There were no signs of the Maw, no echoes of Kezra, but the message was clear. This wasn't a training exercise anymore. This was something older, buried under protocol and silence. A system wrapped in mythology and memory. And now, it had their names. The air shimmered unnaturally. Jasonna, Jace, Korr had learned to trust her instincts on Helion Rift. And every one of them now screamed wrong. A low hum vibrated through the forest floor as she crouched near a cluster of spiral-rooted ferns, her hand tightening on the handle of her straighta blade. The fog wasn't fog anymore. It moved like a living thing, pulsing, curling, whispering through the air in tendrils of metallic vapor. It wasn't just drifting. It was searching. Kezra Nail stood just a few meters behind her, her skeletal exoform twitching beneath pale, translucent armor. "That's not natural mist," she murmured. "No haferiplaith. It's alive." The vapor surged forward without warning. Jace Dove left, tucking into a roll, but Kezra stayed where she was, arms flaring wide, a clicking rhythm sounding from the ridges of her hardened limbs. A defensive posture. Adare. The vapor responded. It condensed instantly into a shape. Humanoid, eyeless, hollow-chested, and lunged at her. But Kezra didn't flinch. She drove the blunt edge of her straighta blade through the center mass. It passed through like smoke. Not solid. Not ghost. Something in between. Jace shouted, "Fall back," but Kezra didn't move. The thing reformed behind her. Without turning, Kezra whipped a vial from her bark-lace satchel, a thin shard of pyronite, the heat crystal they'd salvaged days ago. She crushed it between her palms. The reaction was immediate. Heat blasted outward, searing the fog being's form. It convulsed, destabilized, and began to retreat. But Kezra's body wasn't built to withstand pyronite raw. Her exoskeleton hissed. cracks webbed across her outer plates. The glowing seam along her spine dimmed as smoke curled from her joints. Jace watched, frozen in place, as the cadet she'd fought beside for days began to unravel. Not explode, not burn, but dissolve, as if the pyronite had activated something dormant inside her biology. Kezra turned to Jace, half of her face already melting into ash and glass. Her voice crackled like breaking stone. "Run." Jace shook her head. No, I'm not. Run." The fog being shrieked, now fragmenting in all directions, its cohesion broken. Jace stumbled back, heat pressing against her like a wall. She grabbed the nearest vine, kicked off a low root, and launched herself through the underbrush. Behind her, the forest lit up in brief, radiant flame. And then, silence. No screams, no sound, just the soft rain of broken foliage drifting to the earth like falling ash. She collapsed by a low ridge, chest heaving, heart thundering in her throat. Kezra's last words looped in her mind. Not a command, but a gift. "By time. Save one more. Hold the line." She didn't know what that vapor creature was. She didn't care. All she knew was that Kezra had given everything to stop it. And it still wasn't over. The silence after Kezra's death was absolute. Jasonna Jace Korr sat against the base of a stone root tree, her knees drawn to her chest, her breath shallow and uneven. The forest wasn't quiet. It listened. Every rustle, every insect hum seemed to pause whenever she moved, as if Helion Rift itself was waiting to see what she would do next. And Jace wasn't sure. Her fingers hovered over the riftband kit clipped to her belt. Among its contents, cord, thermal veil, mapping slate, was something they'd all been warned never to touch unless ordered by command. The emergency distress node. A black disc no bigger than her palm. Smooth, cold, embedded with a crimson core. Activating it was grounds for disqualification. More than that, it would supposedly trigger an Aegis drone, calling retrieval signal failure. But what if that was a lie? Jace turned the disc in her hand. Kezra's last moments still burned behind her eyes. That thing, the vapor entity, wasn't part of any standardized test. No hay simulation. No drone feedback loop. It reacted to pyronite. It killed biologically. And what if it wasn't the only one? She exhaled sharply. Screw it. With a press of her thumb, the node blinked to life. Nothing happened at first. Then, the air grew denser. She felt it before she saw it. The strange magnetic pull across her skin, the faint vibration in her bones. The riftband chimed once, then went dead. The mapping slate on her satchel shorted out. Even the Kaltweave shroud around her shoulders shivered and collapsed into inert fabric. Then came a sound, not the whir of rotors, not the hum of an Aegis drone. A tone, low, resonant, and deeply alien. It echoed through the trees, and for a moment, the canopy parted on its own, bending away like reeds in water. A column of pale blue light shot down from the sky and anchored itself in a nearby clearing, flickering with symbols that didn't match any stellar ascendancy coding she'd ever seen. Jace crouched low, heart hammering. The beam shimmered, then condensed into a shape, too humanoid to be a drone, too smooth to be a cadet. A figure wrapped in living light. Eyes like molten glass. It didn't walk. It drifted forward. She took a step back. "Identify," she said hoarsely. It didn't answer. Instead, the being tilted its head slightly, as if confused by her words. Then its gaze locked onto her wrist, onto the now dormant node. Jace gritted her teeth. "You're not a rescue unit." And then it spoke, but not aloud. It projected, a frequency that bypassed her ears and scraped directly across her mind. Words shaped like sound waves in pressure. Genesis marker confirmed. Genetic signal matched. Observation continues. And with that, it vanished, sucked upward into the beam, which blinked out a second later. Jace stood frozen, her mind reeling. Genesis marker? Genetic signal? None of that had been in the training manuals. Her riftband rebooted slowly, as if waking from shock. The kit chimed once. One message displayed across its small screen. Rule violation logged. Result, unknown. She sat back, stunned. The distress beacon hadn't called help. It had called something else. And whoever, or whatever, was behind the Spectre drones had just confirmed they were watching far more than behavior. They were watching blood. The next morning, the canopy glowed faintly violet as dawn crept over Helion Rift. Jace moved through the underbrush with deliberate steps, every sense sharpened. She hadn't slept, not after that encounter. The image of the light being haunted her, its words etched into her thoughts like burn marks. Genesis marker confirmed. She needed answers, and she knew exactly where to find them. Perched in the high boughs of a twisted crookwood tree was a Spectre drone. Most cadets avoided them. After all, they weren't rescue units. They didn't speak, didn't respond. They hovered in silence, recording, watching, drifting just out of reach. But Jace had learned to study them. There was a pattern to their hovering, a hesitation before their retreat, a strange glow that shimmered when multiple cadets gathered. She crept upward through the branches, keeping her movements slow and quiet. The drone didn't react. When she was close enough to see its emitter core, she slipped a small Trier echo stone from her satchel, an old trick her grandfather had used to bounce scanner signals off damaged panels. She whispered, "Let's see what you're really watching." She flicked the stone beneath the drone. It pulsed once, then flashed back a flicker of data through her wristband. And that's when the secrets spilled open. Not through files, through holograms. From the core of the Spectre drone bloomed a shifting lattice of glowing DNA strands, biometric patterns, neural response webs. Floating in the air before her was her, or rather, her genetic blueprint. Not just Jace. Others too. Frexvarn, Nail, Theroin, Varanek, Kezra Nail, even the ones who had already vanished from the test. She tapped her wristband. None of this was supposed to be in their evaluation. No mention of DNA mapping, neural stress monitoring, or genetic divergence markers. This wasn't a test of survival techniques. It was selection. A slow, cold understanding settled in her gut. The Stellar Ascendancy Corps wasn't just testing how well cadets adapted. They were cataloging them, comparing genomes, stress responses, cross-species viability. Her eyes narrowed. This wasn't a survival exam. It was a harvest. Suddenly, the drone pulsed red. She dropped, barely dodging the scan beam that surged through the air. The Spectre unit whirred angrily and shot upward, disappearing into the canopy like a startled predator. Jace gritted her teeth, her breath ragged. Whatever the Stellar Ascendancy was planning, she was now a threat to it, and she had just made herself visible. The signal flare hadn't even faded when Jace heard footsteps, light, precise, coming from behind the ridge. She spun, blade raised, heart hammering. "Easy," Frexvarn called, both arms raised in the universal sign of peace. His sleek, angular features caught the morning light through the trees. "It's just me." Jace narrowed her eyes. "You've been gone since the Red Rain. Where the hell were you?" Frex offered a lopsided smile. "Scouting. Watching." That answer didn't sit right. Jace had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, every one of them was screaming. "You weren't just watching, Threx," she said slowly. "You avoided every Umbra Maw encounter. You knew the safe zones, and you never once looked surprised when someone vanished." He didn't deny it. Instead, he sighed, the performative charm slipping from his voice. "You were always too sharp for your own good." Jace took a step back. "What are you?" "I'm a cadet," Threx said, "but not like you. My role was embedded observation. The Corps wanted someone native to Helion-adjacent biospheres. Voker physiology allows me to process rift-based neurotoxins. I could blend in, monitor reactions, and feed data directly to Spectre relays." Her stomach turned. "You knew this wasn't just a training test." "I knew," he said evenly, "and I stayed quiet. That was the job." Jace's grip tightened on her blade. "And the others? Did you just watch them die?" "Some." His voice remained emotionless. "Others were necessary variables. You, though? You were a priority subject." "What does that mean?" Before he could answer, a low hum rippled through the trees, the approach of another Spectre drone. Threx backed away. "I warned them you'd break protocol. Now they'll come. You'll see the truth. All of it." Jace stared, disbelief and fury crashing in her chest. Then I'll survive, she said coldly, and I'll tear that truth down. Threx didn't stop her as she turned and disappeared into the brush. But he did whisper one last thing, barely audible over the rising drone sound. Let's hope you survive long enough to understand why you were chosen. The forest had always watched them. Now, Jace watched it back, with fire in her blood. She moved through the twisted paths of Halion Rift, not as a hunted cadet, but as someone who'd glimpsed the strings behind the curtain. Her thoughts burned with everything Threx had revealed. This wasn't a survival test. It was a biological experiment dressed in dirt and blood. When she reached the shelter where Dorn Kravok and Varanek were camped, they were already on edge. Dorn's massive Dorothi frame turned first, eyes wide. Jace, you look like hell. I just found out we all do, she snapped. They've been mapping our genomes, using drones to log our stress responses, watching us kill, break, bleed. And Threx? He's not one of us, he's one of them. Vare stepped forward, translucent skin shimmering as his pulse surged visibly beneath the surface. You're saying we were never meant to pass? No, Jace said. We were meant to reveal who adapts, who resists, who breaks. A silence hung between them, broken only by the soft crackle of a Barclay's fireleaf bundle Dorn had lit for warmth. Vare spoke quietly. Then what now? Keep surviving until they decide who's worthy. Jace stepped closer, her voice low but fierce. No, we hit back. We disrupt the biosignal loops. Tear down the drones. If Halion Rift is alive, we show it that we're not prey. We're aware. Dorn's lips curled into a grim smile. About time. Together, they began crafting crude EMP pulses using fractured pyronite shards and magnetized magpulse halos. Vare-shaped signal blockers from Barclays wraps and spearfruit cores, natural disruptors of the drone frequencies. Every cadet's trick, every survival hack, was retooled for rebellion. It wasn't elegant, but it was human. It was real. As night fell, they climbed to the treetops, placing the blockers at signal relay points, forcing the Spectre drones to recalibrate mid-flight. A few crashed. One exploded in a burst of synthetic flame. The Force noticed. Loom sprites returned, their light no longer circling in warning, but in patterns, as if the rift itself approved. Jace stared into the glowing sky, defiant. Let them watch. Let them know. The test ends now. And as the canopy rustled with something vast shifting just beyond the treeline, she didn't feel fear. She felt momentum. The earth trembled as Jace and Dorn Kravok moved deeper into the tunnel. Every step brought the temperature down, and the air turned thick, not just with moisture, but with weight. It felt as if the planet itself was holding its breath. Behind them, Varanek's near-invisible form flickered like heat haze. His translucent skin reflected the dim, bioluminescent moss clinging to the tunnel walls. The trio had followed a series of echo stone pulses, tones that resonated only when activated by synchronized heartbeats. That's how Jace knew they were close. Too close. They emerged into a hollow the size of a hangar, its ceiling lost in shadow. The floor was metallic, ancient and scarred, but still pulsing faintly with lines of violet light that snaked like veins across the surface. A massive construct rose at the chamber's center, a tower of shifting plates, fluid and alive, humming with restrained energy. At its heart, a sphere suspended in midair, spinning slowly, casting reflections of unknown constellations across the walls. Jace took a step forward, breath caught in her throat. This isn't a monument, she murmured. It's a living archive. Vare stepped beside her, eyes locked on the spinning core. It's recording us. All of us. Every movement. Every biological response. Everything since the moment we landed. Dorn grunted, resting a hand on the hilt of his straight blade. Then who built it? Jace didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the floor around the core. Symbols, some familiar, others impossibly alien, burned faintly beneath layers of dust. Observe. Analyze. Select. The words weren't just commands. They were identity. She staggered back, blinking hard. It's not just a test, she said. It's a filter. A gatekeeper. And it's no longer taking orders from anyone. Dorn stepped forward. Then who is it choosing? Jace stared at the Korr. Those who listen. Those who adapt. Not the strongest. Not the smartest. Just those who understand they're not alone here. For the first time since their descent, she felt it. Not fear, but a clarity that chilled her to the bone. They weren't just surviving Helion Rift. They were part of it now. And the rift was awake. The forest stirred with unfamiliar tension. From the canopy above, the strange whispers of wind moved like a message, unreadable yet urgent. Jace stood silent near the edge of the monument chamber, her mind still grappling with what the Korr had shown her. Dorn watched the tunnel warily, his massive form tense and ready. Then came a sound, footsteps. Fast, uneven. Someone was running. From the darkness burst a figure cloaked in shadows and sweat, Jaro Vale. His blue-toned skin, marred with bruises, gleamed with urgency as he stumbled into the chamber, clutching a scorched magpulse halo. It sparked erratically, the metal rim warped, barely functional. His eyes locked onto Jace's, burning with something new, resolve. You're alive, Jace breathed, stunned. Barely, Jaro rasped. I figured something out. The drones. The Spectras. They're not just observers anymore. They're controlling access points across the rift. Routing energy, isolating cadets. I tracked their movement signatures. Dorn narrowed his gaze. Why come back? You were already out. Jaro swallowed, glancing at the blinking lights overhead. Because I left someone behind. All of you. He stepped forward, dragging a piece of folded polymetal plating from his back, marked with hastily drawn diagrams. There's a fail-safe hidden in the spectra frequency code. It's old, buried under layers of biometric feedback. But if we mimic the drone's own shutdown command at just the right pulse interval, we can override the spectral logic loop, kill their judgment protocol. Their neck blinked into visibility. That would blind the entire evaluation system. Exactly, Jaro said. No more scoring. No more eliminations. Just us free. Jace looked at him, this cadet she had once dismissed as reckless, maybe even cowardly. But now, she saw the burn marks on his palms, the determination stitched into his every breath. He hadn't given up. He had grown. She stepped toward him. You sure this works? No, he admitted, but I tested it once. Took out 3 drones before they noticed me. I only survived because I crawled into a Vark scuttler tunnel and didn't move for 6 hours. Dorn smirked. That's either insane or genius. Jaro shrugged. Maybe both. Either way, I came back to finish what we started. Jace nodded. Then let's shut them down. In that moment, something shifted, not in the rift, but between them. Not command, not obedience. Trust. In a place built to separate them. That was the one thing Helion Rift couldn't predict. The silence was different now. Not the eerie quiet of predatory stillness, or the atmospheric hum of Helion Rift's living forest. This was a silence that pressed inward, like a vacuum around her thoughts. Jace walked alone, separated from the others, after the group split to deploy Jaro's disruption codes. The narrow passage she followed twisted deeper beneath the monument's base, its walls pulsing faintly as if reacting to her presence. It wasn't just a tunnel. It was a test. She could feel it. The temperature dropped. Her breath misted in front of her, hanging unnaturally long in the air. Each footstep echoed in her chest more than her ears. The metal beneath her boots turned warm, then icy, cycling with no rhythm. The rift was watching. And then, the corridor opened into a chamber bathed in soft blue light. At its center stood herself. Jace froze. The figure mirrored her exactly. Same height, same rough-cut jacket, even a tiny scar under her left eye. But the eyes were off. Not mechanical. Not glowing. Just too calm. You are Jasonna, Korr, the copy said, voice nearly indistinguishable from her own. Cadet. Human. Observed. Analyzed. Interpreted. Jace's hand slid to her belt, brushing her straight blade. I'm not interested in playing games with clones, she growled. This is not a game, the copy replied. It is your final trial. The room shifted. Memories bled through the walls. Her childhood in Moss Ridge Mountains, the warmth of her grandfather's stories, the snowfields of Terradia. Then came the training sessions at Stellar Ascendancy Korr, the friend she lost on day one of the drop, the long, sleepless nights beneath whispering vines. The images swirled, then vanished. "You've adapted," said the double. "But do you know who you are without adaptation?" Jace's jaw clenched. "I'm not here to be judged by a mimic. You misunderstand. I'm not here to judge you," the copy said softly. "I am you, formed from Helion Rift's understanding of your biology, history, and decision-making. I am what this world thinks you should become." Jace stepped forward. "Then let me make this clear. I decide who I become. Not you, not the Korr, not this rift." The double nodded slowly and drew a blade. It wasn't a fight of strength. It was a fight of will. They clashed in silence. No words, no grunts, just motion. Each strike was mirrored. Each counter met with its reflection. The walls pulsed in rhythm with their movements, as if the rift were absorbing their decisions in real time. Jace ducked low under a sweep, rolled, and came up behind her twin. But instead of striking, she hesitated, just for a breath. It was enough. The double kicked backward, sending her sprawling. The blade flew from Jace's hand, skittering across the floor. She scrambled, reached, too late. The copy stood over her, blade raised, and then paused. Jace looked up, breathing hard. Her hand slid toward her chest, over her heart, where her riftband kit still glowed faintly. Not from combat, from choice. "I won't kill you," she said. The double's hand trembled. The blade lowered. "Because you're not a mistake," Jace whispered. "You're a mirror, and maybe I needed to see myself like this, to know that even when everything's stripped away, I'll still stand." The chamber responded with a low resonance. The walls shimmered, then dissolved into light. The clone faded, and Jace was alone once more. But this time, she understood something vital. The rift wasn't just testing her strength, or her mind, or even her heart. It was testing her selfhood, and she had passed, not by winning, but by choosing not to become what others expected. The light from the monument's core faded behind her, but something inside Jace continued to burn, a sense of clarity that hadn't existed before. She emerged from the lower corridors into the open canopy above, where the air shimmered faintly under Helion Rift's bioluminescent sky. Around her, the jungle breathed in slow, steady rhythms, alive and aware. She could feel it in the way the vines subtly bent toward her passage, the way the loom sprites circled just overhead but didn't land. The forest was still watching, still learning, and now so was she. Jace climbed a steep ridge of shattered stone, pulled herself over the edge, and saw it. An ancient comms array barely standing. Half buried in vines, its panels cracked, but its framework remained intact. At its center was a spiraling column of metal etched with unknown glyphs, older than the Ascendancy, older than any of the current star maps. This was never meant for the Stellar Ascendancy Korr. This was meant for something else. She approached carefully, brushing dirt and moss from the glyphs with the edge of her Barclay's satchel. As she studied the base, her fingers found a faint groove, a handprint, humanoid-sized. Without hesitation, she placed her palm into it. The column pulsed once. Energy surged through the stone underfoot. The wind shifted, and from deep inside the ridge, gears began to move. A low hum rose from the array as a series of aerial spires unfolded, reaching upward like skeletal fingers toward the stars. Dust shook loose. A soft tone vibrated in her chest. Not sound, but memory. Jace knew what she had to do. She pulled her Trier Echo Stone from her belt, modified by Jaro, retuned to bridge frequencies. She placed it into the central core of the column. The light pulsed in response, syncing with her heartbeat. Then she spoke, quietly but with purpose. To anyone out there, we are here. Not cadets, not pawns, survivors, learners. And we've seen what lies beneath your trials. She didn't know if the signal would reach a satellite, a listening post, or something even farther away. She didn't even know if it would be heard at all. But it didn't matter. Sometimes it wasn't about getting an answer. It was about refusing to stay silent. The sky above Helion Rift shimmered with a strange aurora, faint and pulsing. And in that moment, Jace felt something shift, not just in the air, but in herself. She had sent a message beyond the stars. And something, somewhere, was listening. The aurora shimmered above Helion Rift like a living pulse. Colors bled into one another, blue to violet to gold, as if the sky itself had been stirred awake. Jace stood beneath it, the ancient array quiet once more, her hands still resting on the warm stone. And then they came. Aegis drones, black-winged sentinels with smooth, soundless propulsion, descended from the clouds. Dozens of them, moving in precise formation, scanning the terrain with beams of soft white light. She saw one pause over a scorched clearing where Kezra had fallen. Another hovered briefly beside a spiraling vine that once whispered her name. They weren't retrieving the injured. They weren't punishing the survivors. They were choosing. A single drone hovered before her. Its optics dilated, projecting soft geometric waves across her chest and face, bioscans. Her wristband kit, still active but unmodified, blinked green once. Then the drone rotated slowly and moved on. Behind her, Dorn Kravok emerged from the tree line, carrying Veranek, barely conscious, wrapped in a cult-weave shroud. They looked battered but alive. More drones began to descend near other cadets, not to rescue, but to observe. Then, without warning, several drones changed course. They shot toward a glade where Jace had earlier seen Threx Varn and two others, cadets who had used tech, tampered with the forest, broken the silent pact. A piercing hum erupted. Seconds later, the drones vanished in a flare of light, and the glade went still. Jace's breath caught. Not everyone would be taken. Not everyone was meant to leave. The forest had its rules. So did the machine. And somewhere in between, a decision had been made. One of the drones returned, this time lowering a glider nest, unfolding like a sleek petal. Its surface rippled, adapting to the terrain. It opened, not as a cage, but an invitation. Jace looked at Dorn, then at Ver, and nodded. They stepped forward together, the hum of the forest deepening as they moved. As they boarded the glider, Jace glanced back at the jungle canopy. Somewhere out there, echoes of the trials still stirred. The whispers of the vines, the shimmer of loom sprites, the quiet beat of a world that had watched her, not as prey, but as possibility. The glider nest rose slowly, lifting them above the rift. The forest shrank beneath them, but Jace didn't feel like she was leaving something behind. She felt like she'd been chosen, not because she fought hardest or solved the most puzzles, but because she listened. At the edge of the atmosphere, just as the canopy disappeared in a cloud, the console beside her pulsed once more. A message blinked on the screen, written in a language she almost recognized. And in one of the ancient glyphs, she saw her own name, Jasonna, not her call sign, not a code, her true name. Somewhere far above, a signal traveled, and somewhere beyond, something old and waiting had heard her voice. And it had answered. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If this story made you feel something, even just a little, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, or sharing it with someone you love. More stories are on the way, and I'll be right here, ready to tell the next one whenever you're ready to listen.